Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Huck. Today we are talking about my worst books of the year for 2020. So my least favorite, my most disappointing. I have 6 books to talk about today. 5 of them fall into the most disappointing category. One of them I just ended up hating. But most of these are just disappointing because either I ended up realizing that they weren't what I was wanting out of the book, they just have things that didn't work for me, realizing they were genres I don't like, whatever. So they were disappointing but not necessarily terrible books. So we're gonna start with those and end with the book that I just disliked the most. But starting with disappointing reads, first up I have Giddy and the Ninth by Tamsin Muir. This is a kind of sci fantasy with necromancers in space, and this book I feel like got a lot of hype, and I just really found the hype was not true for me. Some people loved this and found the hype to be very accurate, but this really isn't my thing. I think I did have some actual complaints about like the world building. I felt like it really lacked in world building and I didn't really understand this world or universe that it was in. A lot of the things that were motivating like the main thrust of the plot, I didn't feel like I understood enough about the different houses because there are different like necromantic houses in this world. The characters didn't feel very distinct from one another. I really only knew who like the 2 main characters were, and then like 1 or 2 other side characters, but there are a lot of other characters in this and they all kind of bled together. So there were some things that I had like particular complaints about it, but overall I think this really just wasn't for me and didn't live up to the hype for me and what I wanted out of it. For one thing, this essentially just turns into like a closed circle mystery, which is not something I generally enjoy. I don't really like the main characters in this and the humor that is in this, because it does have a very distinct like sense of humor to it. I don't really like the author's tone or voice in this because it also has a very distinct tone which wasn't working for me. So there were a lot of elements about it that just didn't click with me and what I was wanting out of it, but it's also one that I can definitely see that if you enjoy these characters and if you like the humor and you enjoy that tone, I could see why this can work for other people, but it really was not my thing, and I was very disappointed. Next, I have The Unspoken Name by A.K. Larkwood. This one I kind of went in with some reservations, knowing it may not be exactly for me, because it has like orc main characters, like the main character is an orc priestess, and that's not something I'm generally drawn to, but it was something I was willing to give a try. I had heard some really good things about this from some reviewers that really got me interested in this, but the plot structure of this book was very weird to me, because the book is kind of split into sections, and the first 2 sections, which are essentially the first half of the book, are not the main plot. We don't get into the main plot of the story until like 50% of the way into the book. And so those 2 first sections just ended up feeling like really long, irrelevant prologues. And I dislike prologues to begin with. It's just a pet peeve. I don't like prologues in books in general. So to have it feel like there were these 2 excessively long prologues before we even got to the main plot was really frustrating. And it also just made the pacing of the story very weird. I remember thinking that also the information that was in those prologues, or in that first half that felt like a prologue, was kind of unnecessary, because a lot of it was set up, and I think it was things that could have been accomplished through like flashbacks or other devices in it that would have been quicker and given us the same amount of information, especially because another complaint that I had about that first half of the book was that I felt like it skipped over a lot of the character development and the kind of experiential parts of the story. And then also because we skipped over a lot of those experiential elements of the story, it was difficult to get to know the characters, because characters going through hardship and struggling and learning and all of that, a lot of times that's how we get to know a character. And then for the rest of the book, they just ended up feeling very two-dimensional because I never really got to know them. I also felt like the author really just told us a lot of things about the characters. So there was a lot about this that it felt very surface level, I guess, and I never was fully invested in it. I did think it had some really interesting ideas. It had a lot of potential. I thought the ideas behind the world that she created were really interesting, but they just never felt fully fleshed out. Then the next 3 books kind of have almost similar vibes to me. In a way, they're kind of categorized in my brain in the same place. So I think I've learned that maybe books that have whatever this vibe is, I should not read in the future because I didn't like any of these. But first up is The Starless Sea by Erin Morgenstern. This is another one that was super hyped. It was definitely a polarizing book. Some people loved it, some people didn't. So I kind of went into it knowing that, but I was really expecting to love this because it's a book about books. It has a subterranean library. You know, this is the first thing I've read from Erin Morgenstern, but I always hear people raving about how beautiful and atmospheric her writing is. And, you know, that's all things that I love. And also that it is kind of like a slower story. So those are all things that would make me think I would love this. And then it just didn't work for me. I didn't really like the writing in this. I didn't find it particularly atmospheric. I think that she did a really good job of building an aesthetic, but aesthetic and atmosphere are different to me because an aesthetic is what something looks like and an atmosphere is what it feels like. And I'm more interested in the atmosphere of the place and what it feels like to be there than what it looks like. But I did like the aesthetic of it. But I also found the writing to be very tedious because it was descriptive in a way that just was excessive. Also, you know, the plot is pretty much non-existent in this, which plot is something that, you know, I can kind of take or leave, but since a lot of other elements of the story weren't working for me, I also found it frustrating that there wasn't at least a plot to be interested in. And the characters felt very flat and two-dimensional. They were very passive, they had very little personality to me, and I didn't really understand what any of their motives were. And really, I got the feeling that the purpose of this book is to appreciate the aesthetic of this world that she has created. It's to explore this world. And so these characters really are meant to be kind of an empty vessel for the reader to ride as we explore the world, right? And so the characters themselves didn't really need to be interesting people, and they weren't. But since I wasn't particularly interested in just exploring the aesthetic of the world, and I wanted more about these characters, it just wasn't working for me. So this is another one that I can understand how this could work for some people if you really love this aesthetic and if you appreciate the level of detail of description that she has. I can see that. Yeah, and if you just like the exploration of the world through the eyes of these characters. But this really, really didn't work for me. Next up is The 13th Tale by Diane Setterfield. This is another book about books, which is part of why I was so excited about it, and then it ended up being very disappointing. And from reading this, I think that I have determined that I am not a fan of Gothic literature. So after reading this, I did some research about like what makes something Gothic, and I realized that a lot of the tropes and themes and the kind of tone and atmosphere are just not things that appeal to me in a story, and a lot of them were some of the elements about this that I specifically didn't like. So this did help me kind of realize that Gothic is not a vibe for me in books, which is helpful to know. But that meant that I really didn't enjoy this. I didn't like the, you know, tone and atmosphere of it. I also didn't like the writing style, but that's something that was a stylistic choice on the part of the author, which I can totally understand, but it wasn't something that worked for me because I think she was purposefully trying to mimic a more old-fashioned writing style, more similar to classics like Jane Eyre, which is a book that's really frequently referenced in this book. And that's a choice that the author made, which is totally understandable, and I could see other people enjoying that writing style, but I don't enjoy that writing style, and I just found it so frustrating to read, and it had like this really awkward cadence to the reading that I could never fully get into the flow of reading. So I ended up actually switching from reading it physically to reading it as an audiobook because I just could not stand the writing style. I also didn't really like any of the characters. I wasn't invested in any of them or interested in any of them. I didn't really care about this woman's backstory or the younger woman like piecing together the more like current timeline pieces of story that she was collecting. I just was like so emotionally disconnected from everything that was happening in this book. So there were just a lot of things about this that were very clearly like not for me, even though I can understand how other people may like this if they like gothic books. Then next up we have The Betrayals by Bridget Collins. This might be the most disappointing because I was so excited about this. This is Bridget Collins' second adult book. Her first one was The Binding, which was one of my favorites last year, so I was really excited to have a new book from her, and this one just really like didn't work for me for so many reasons. So this takes place in a kind of exclusive academy that's secluded up in the mountains, and they teach this like mysterious game that's never fully explained, and we're following two main characters who are Leo and Claire is the only female magister at this academy, and Leo used to be a student there, and then he was like sent back to the academy kind of in disgrace from his political career. And it's sort of about like they end up having a romance, and there are just so many things about this that I disliked. Like I feel like it really lacked in world building, and there were just things about the world that felt like they were kind of tossed in with no explanation, and so then they ended up feeling irrelevant. There was also just a lot of irrelevant information in this. There was an entire character perspective, who is actually a third character, that her entire character was like 99% irrelevant to the story, and I just was like, why is she here? Her perspective was also really boring, so it was just really weird. I wasn't invested in any of the characters. I didn't care about their romance. There's like a weird twist at the end, which I guessed the twist almost at the beginning, and then I kind of was hoping that that wasn't what the twist was, and then it ended up being the twist, and I didn't even like the way it was revealed. There were so many elements of this that I think just didn't work, even though I felt like this had a lot of potential to be an interesting book. So this one was just the most disappointing because I was so excited to have a new book from this author. I do have, so I'm going to link below. I didn't do a dedicated review for this one, but like the wrap up that this one was in, like half the video is pretty much just a review for this book because I had things to say about it. And finally, my last book and my least favorite book that I read in this entire year was What Should Be Wild by Julia Fine. This is about a girl who is born with the ability to kill or resurrect living things with her touch. And then her mother dies, and her father kind of whisks her away to their family mansion, and she lives there very secluded from the rest of the world as he kind of studies her, because he's not exactly a scientist, but like sort of. So he's like studying her and trying to figure out where this power is coming from and how it works. And then one day her father disappears, and so she sets off to find out what happened to her father. And then there's also there's some flashbacks where we're following different women from different generations throughout her family, because apparently there is a generational family curse that is passed through the women in this family. So we're also kind of going back and finding out about their stories as well. And this book, I feel like I cannot fully express what I hated about it, but I hated the main character. Like, the book started out kind of interesting because it has a magical forest, it has this like dark, macabre atmosphere to it. Like, there were some things that were interesting about it, but very quickly devolved because I just could not stand the main character. I was just tired of her almost immediately because she was so frustrating. There were very few other characters or other side characters, but I wasn't interested in any of them, and I hated her relationship and dynamic with like every single other character in this book. I also thought that the flashbacks and information that we got about the other women in her family felt very like disdainful and dismissive of them and what they've been through. Also, the magic in this was very inconsistent. Like, it's soft magic, it's not super explained, it doesn't have like hard rules to it, but you know, over time we kind of learn how it works and what she can and can't do. And then there's a point in the story where all of that goes out the window and she can just kind of do whatever she wants. And she does things that I just was sitting there like, since when can she do this? This not only is like a completely new ability that has nothing to do with literally anything else, but sometimes she would do things I was like, this is completely like counter to everything that we have known about her powers up until this point. And then the author also used some like weird, I guess, writing devices, you would call them, I don't know, but one of the things that was just so bizarre to me was that very often to show almost anything, like the passage of time, characters growing up, but also just like characters like emotionally maturing, and just to kind of describe or show emotions, the author would use descriptions of the characters like breasts and nipples in like every instance she possibly could in order to describe things that had nothing to do with them. And I was like, people can express emotions in ways other than their nipples. You like, I don't know who's out there express like what the author, it was very weird and I was not a fan. And this book, like, these are all things that I disliked, but like I don't know how to explain like why I hated this book so much. But I do remember that when I finished it, I like had to walk it off. Like I had to go for a walk to like walk off how angry I felt about having finished this book, because otherwise I was gonna just like sit there and seethe about it. And it's very rare for me to dislike a book so much that I'm just like, I have to walk it off. Alright, so those are my least favorite books from 2020. Thank you all for watching, and until next time, bye.